Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. A little bit of a delay, but technical difficulties. All right, but we've got captions already working. All right, we're ahead on that deal then, at least. All right, so where were we? We've read the first 4 articles in this book, Forbidden Religion, and ready to jump into 5 and 6 tonight, and that should finish out this section of the book. Yes. And then we get into a complete, well, I'm not going to say completely different um, subject. It is related. But here we go. Number 5, spreading the goddess gospel. Thanks to the Da Vinci Code, Margaret Starbird finds herself with a worldwide audience. By Cynthia Logan. After the Da Vinci Code topped the bestseller list, an author Dan Brown picked up the phone and called Margaret Starbird. He wanted to acknowledge the primary concept he had gleaned from her work, the idea that Jesus Christ was married to Mary Magdalene. Starbird's books, The Woman with the Alabaster Jar and The Goddess in the Gospels, had given him ample research to back the material in his page-turning thriller. Starbird, in turn, got her food for thought from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the premise of which is not only that was Christ married, but that his wife and bloodline have survived in Western Europe, something Starbird, a practicing Roman Catholic and Vanderbilt divinity scholar, had found disturbing. She couldn't bring herself to buy the book, but borrowed it from the library. Reading the back cover, she was appalled. In an insightful interview, she recounted the experience. Quote, "I almost threw it down, almost fled from the building," she said. She says of her first encounter with a hypothesis she knew would challenge her beliefs to the core. "I was not merely shocked by the idea, I was shattered." End of quote. But open-mindedness and a desire to know the truth guided her, and as she pondered, she had to admit the theory was provocative and that the compilation of evidence strongly suggested the truth had been ruthlessly suppressed by the Orthodox Catholic hierarchy and the Inquisition. With the support of her prayer group, she began what would become a 7-year journey to debunk what she still considered blasphemy, investigating it through a study of history, symbolism, medieval art, Freemasonry, mythology, psychology, and the Bible. The result was a radical restructuring of her faith and the birth of her first book. Quote, "It was a labor both long and difficult," she remembers. "At times I thought it would turn me inside out. Doctrines I had believed on faith had to be uprooted. The entire framework of my childhood had to be dismantled to uncover the dangerous fault in the foundation, and the belief system carefully rebuilt when the fissures had been sealed." End quote. But even as a former Fulbright Fellow at Christian Albrechts Universität in Kiel, Germany, with an MA in Comparative Literature, University of Maryland, Starbird never intended to write a book. Quote, "I was just researching this because I was passionate to know Christ better." End quote. Without industry contacts, she didn't expect the book to be published, but she queried a single publisher anyway. She was advised to send the full manuscript with enough postage for return after rejection. But 2 months later, she received a letter saying that hers would be among the 12 out of 7,000 manuscripts received that would be published that year. She was astonished to read, quote, "Yours is a book we've been looking for all over the world." End quote. The Woman with the Alabaster Jar is now available in 12 languages and has become a quiet bestseller in its own genre. I'll have to look. I have so many electronic books. I'll see if I have that book. I may possibly have it and not even remember it. Starbird's theory of the Magdalene stands on two pillars: the ancient science of gematria, ancient Greek and Hebrew numbers contained within the letters of the alphabet, and myths dating back to Neolithic matriarchal cultures. In particular, she cites the myth of the bridegroom king, who is the first anointed by the highest representative of the goddess, joined to her in marriage, then tortured, killed, and planted to ensure that the crops will flourish and the people will prosper. This was a physical rite in some cultures, in others the king was symbolically sacrificed. Starbird notes that this ritual was part of the cultures of Sumer, Babylon, and Canaan, or Canaan, I guess. Among others, in many versions of this story, the couple are reunited in a garden. In Greek mythology, this rite is known as the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage. Since Israel was under Greek influence for nearly 300 years following the conquests of Alexander the Great, it is logical that the Hebrews were aware of such a rite. Quote, "Its mythological content would have been understood by the Hellenized community of Christians who heard the gospel preached in the cities of the Roman Empire, where the cults of the love goddesses were not completely extinguished until the end of the 5th century AD. Writes Starbird, who thinks there is abundant evidence that it was Mary Magdalene who anointed Jesus with spikenard as a marriage ritual, and that the anointing was recognized as such by those in attendance. For starters, quote, "It should have been scandalous for a woman, any woman, to touch a Jewish man in public, but there's barely a hint that Jesus' friends were scandalized by her action," she writes. She points out that the Hebrew Scriptures Song of Songs, widely popular in Palestine during the time of Christ, was the wedding song of the shepherd/king and his bride, and that identical lines are found in a liturgical poem from the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis. Starbird provides further parallels, stating that the frequent allusions to Jesus as the bridegroom of the fertility myth could be, quote, "the creation of the Hellenized authors of the Gospels," end quote, none of whom actually knew Christ. But she thinks it far more likely that those allusions originated with Jesus himself. In the Hebrew tradition, prophets had proclaimed Yahweh as the heavenly bridegroom of the community of the king of Israel, and the king of Israel as his faithful son, the anointed Messiah, terms also found in Sumerian and Canaanite mythologies. Which leads to the question, was Jesus a real person or a mythological being? Quote, "I personally think that somebody named Jesus or Yeshua lived in the 1st century and actually embodied the myth," end quote, says Starbird. Quote, "People noticed that and recognized him as the Messiah. I think Christ came to embody that myth, but I think it was the myth of sacred partnership that he and Magdalene embodied together," end quote. This is the crux of her message, that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were representatives of a unified masculine and feminine principle as old as the cosmos itself. She explains the quote-unquote fire, pyramidal apex on top, and water, apex pointing downward, triangles as symbols of these principles, noting that the hexagram formed when joining them is the star of partnership. Interestingly, it has been a universal symbol for union since prehistoric times. In the East Indian tradition of Shiva and Shakti embracing, in Plato's harmonic fusion of opposites, in the Seal of Solomon, inside the Ark of the Covenant, and in the Great Seal of the United States, placed by the Founding Fathers in the mandala of the 13 stars that represent the first colonies. Starbird is the first to admit that her theory isn't provable. Quote, "What I have is a huge case of circumstantial evidence," end quote. But she is frustrated by Christian fundamentalist writers who dismiss her theory because she doesn't have a PhD after her name. For a quiet-spoken, rational woman, her opinions can be mighty strong. For instance, she feels that although, quote, "Roman Catholic fundamentalist Christian clergy apologists for the church are trying to mainstream everybody," end quote, "they're only following the tradition they've learned and are holding one another up the best they know how." Quote, "One of the things I'm really irritated about in the wake of the Da Vinci Code is that so many people are trying to debunk it and they don't go back and look at my stuff. It's infuriating because I had my PhD except for the dissertation. I was working in Maryland, and my husband, the man who gave her a New Age last name, is a retired Army engineer, was transferred to North Carolina. I married and raised 5 college graduates. I sacrificed my PhD for my family, and now I'm written off. They won't even look at the evidence I bring. I can't prove that the tenets of the quote-unquote Grail heresy are true. I can't even prove that Mary Magdalene was the woman with the alabaster jar who anointed Jesus at Bethany. But I can verify that these are tenets of a heresy widely believed in the Middle Ages, that fossils of it can be found in numerous works of art and literature, that it was vehemently attacked by the hierarchy of the established Church of Rome, and that it survived in spite of relentless persecution," end quote. This so-called heresy has a number of variations, from the Gnostics to the Cathars to the Rosicrucians. However, its central tenet that Mary Magdalene, Starbird stresses her importance of the final E in her name, following the original Greek gematria and distancing her from a town called Magdala, wasn't a prostitute, but the bride of Christ and the embodiment of the Holy Grail, has incurred the wrath of Catholic orthodoxy for centuries. Starbird can't resist a comparison. Quote, I just watched The Godfather again, and I think the Mafia is built on the same model as the Vatican. Protect each other at all costs and get rid of anyone who is against you. We'll never prove anything against the Vatican because they won't let anyone into their archives. They'll protect their power. That's what the masculine principle does. Like the Enron people, when will we see them in jail? We got Martha Stewart in jail, but not those guys. End quote. That's some dated references. Um, she says these things without anger. She simply sees evidence of the quote-unquote lost feminine everywhere. Quote, it's playing out in the desert right now. The unbalanced masculine principle warps the whole psychology of Western civilization. Because we have so much power, we're trying to impose it on the whole world, end quote. Okay. Starbird feels the only way to heal the planet is to reclaim the feminine principle. Quote, God, I wish they wouldn't quote so much. Quote, we can't hear the voices of wives and children anymore because we've written them out of our story, end quote. Oh, bullshit. Riley, she sums up the family model provided by the Orthodox Church. A patriarchal father divorced from the virgin mother of a perpetual bachelor. She's surprised that with all the questioning of whether, quote-unquote, the code is fact or fiction, the focus isn't on, in her case, the child Magdalene is said to have borne, a daughter known as Sarah Kali. Quote, of all the things in my book, she's the most speculative and she's never questioned, end quote. Laughed Starbird. Quote, there's no proof of the bloodline and I don't think God wanted that to be the issue. People in the Middle Ages latched onto these promises of the Davidic bloodline, but genealogies don't hold up through the Dark Ages. They just don't have the documentation. End quote. Besides, she and Brown agree the message is sacred marriage, not royal blood elitists running around saying, I'm it. She also wonders if chasing historical facts is a waste of time when the real issue is how we live our lives. Quote, the idea was to learn to love the essence of the Gospels in service to others, she says. Quote, end quote. Starbird may be the perfect vessel for voicing what many feminist forces have been saying for centuries. Quote, if someone as conservative as I am can buy this, anyone can, she quips. Her views support the and/both paradigm of the feminine principle rather than the either-or paradigm of the masculine. She remembers expressing her support of the Equal Rights Amendment at Vanderbilt University and the surprise she generated when that support didn't extend to abortion rights. Starbird is a bridge, an example of someone who practices the love Christ taught, not judging people and issues. Gay marriage, for example, doesn't rankle her. Quote, I always ask myself, what would Jesus and Mary do? I think they would embrace the gay community, end quote. Many married priests support her work. In fact, she says that her own priest and most people in her parish agree with her, quietly. Quote, I'm a Roman Catholic, but I don't go to church, she says, sighing. Partly it's her travel schedule. Starbird leads retreats and gives lectures and keynote speeches to keep her from Mass, but it's also an ethical issue. Quote, I put my money where my mouth is. I don't really feel comfortable supporting a church that has so many problems it won't address, end quote. She hasn't seen Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ and doesn't plan to. Ben-Hur works for me, and I think quote, Ben-Hur works for me, and I don't think Gibson's, and I think Gibson's a little off with this, end quote. She's disappointed that once again Gibson portrays Mary Magdalene as a prostitute or an adulteress. Quote, that's 50 years too old. Now we know better than that, end quote. Starbird is appreciative of female clergy, historians, and academics who are willing to see Magdalene raised as an apostle equal to Peter, but thinks they're still missing the mark. God damn quotes. Jesus. Why not just have her write it? Quote, this does not heal the desert, she says firmly. All it does is restore a model for power in the church that's equal to Peter, the rock of Christ's church. But it's not like the yin-yang symbiosis of Christ and Magdalene together. They model the Spirit manifest in the flesh. Thank God Dan Brown caught on to this, end quote. Starbird considers Brown's book an answer to her prayer about getting her work to a wider audience. Quote, Quote, yes, the book is fiction, but the story behind it isn't. There's a 99% chance that Christ was married, end quote. After nearly 2,000 years, writes Starbird, quote, it's time to set the record straight, to revise and complete the gospel story of Jesus to include his wife. Our ravaged environment, our abused children, our maimed veterans, our self-destructing families, and abandoned spouses are all crying for the restoration of the bride of Christ, end quote. She points out that the scriptures never said Jesus wasn't married. They only omitted specific mention of his wife, and the danger to her life seems to have been reason enough to have blotted it from the written record. Amazed at the rapid and growing interest in this subject, Starbird is waiting to see what the Catholic establishment will do. Quote, it is possible that the Vatican will continue to deny that Jesus was married, but it is also possible, when faced with the evidence, that the fathers will decide it is time to receive the bride. Perhaps they will allow the church bells to ring out across the land to announce her safe return and welcome her home, end quote. I'm sorry to be so annoyed by it, but when 3/4 of your article is quote after quote after quote, it gets really damn annoying. Just have her write the article. Anyway, I am surprised it did not have any mention of her reading the Apocrypha, because there's plenty in there that shows that Jesus was married, and that and shows him as a mortal person, not the Son of God, which is why it was all cut out at the Council of Nicaea, which they mentioned in the earlier articles, but surprised that she didn't mention it as part of her research. Anyway, moving on to the last article in this series and in this section, and hopefully it's not a 1.5 million quotes, because as you can tell, those annoy me. Searching for the real Star of Bethlehem. Who were the wise men and what were they up to, by Peter Novak. I've read accounts that there were Zoroastrian priests. They weren't kings, and the Zoroastrians were actually the first monotheists and that's documented. They are older than the Jews by quite a lot. In fact, there's evidence they influenced the Jews to become monotheists, because they were polytheists before that. But I digress. Holding official governmental positions as imperial counselors to the Parthian Empire, the Zoroastrian priests, known as Magi, were renowned for their expertise in religious arts such as prophecy and astrology. Herodotus attested to their astrological prowess. Like it or not, all we know about the Star of Bethlehem rests on what these peculiar stargazing ecclesiastics had to say about it, and perhaps, more importantly, how they reacted to it. They seem to have been the only ones who witnessed this star at all. Contrary to popular imagination, it apparently didn't stand out in the sky and must not have been very impressive to look at. No one in Jerusalem seems to have known anything about this star before the Magi brought it to their attention, and when it was, the whole city seems to have been caught off guard by the news. A quote from Matthew. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. That's Matthew 2, 1 through 3. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. This passage is all we have to go on. Fortunately, it tells us quite a lot. It tells us that the star didn't attract the attention of anyone but astrologers. When the Magi first saw it, it was rising in the east at sunset. Matthew reports that it was rising ente Anatole, a Greek phrase normally translated as in the east, but which in fact refers to a specific astronomical event, the acronical eastern rising of a star, a relatively rare occurrence, when a star rises in the east, just as the sun is setting in the west. Excuse me. And the passage tells us that this star seemed so important to these priests that they decided to make a long and difficult journey to look for a newborn baby. Excuse me. Ugh. And when they found this infant, they intended to worship it like a god. Most theories about the Star of Bethlehem don't take any of this into account. The legend of this celestial event has grown to such proportions that one assumes the star must have been an awesome spectacle, even though the written record describes it as something most people never even heard about. Virtually all theories about the star begin by asking, quote, "What could have made such a striking star appear in the sky in that time in history?" End quote. The proper question, quote, "What could have made the Magi get so excited over such an insignificant looking star in the sky?" End quote, is virtually never asked. Also, no theory explains how the star could have been seen rising on one horizon as the sun was setting on the other. The sun, earth, and star of Bethlehem being in a perfectly straight line, nor why the Magi and later the author of the Gospel of Matthew felt it was so important to pass along this curious detail. And of course, no theory attempts to explain why the Magi had their unique reaction to this star, concluding from it that a baby who deserved to be idolized and worshipped had been born. Dateline Indiana. Dateline India, September 16th, 1 BC. Yet this is all exactly what would have occurred if the Star of Bethlehem had been the star of Uranus. The planet Uranus. There is an excellent chance that the Magi living near India's Indus River discovered the planet Uranus during the new moon of September 16th, 1 BC. They would have been looking in the right place at the right time. And if they did spot Uranus, then they could have reacted exactly as the Bible describes. Numbers of magi did live in India, and they would have had particularly compelling reasons to monitor this new moon. It was an unusual lunation, a rare lineup by anyone's standards. The Sun, the Moon, Jupiter, and Pluto were all tightly grouped together on one side of the sky, and Mars and Uranus close together on the exact opposite side of the sky. In effect, Pluto, Jupiter, the Sun, the Earth, the Moon, Mars, and Uranus were all in a straight line from one side of the solar system to the other. Any new moon that close to Jupiter less than 1 degree away, would have been considered noteworthy by astrologers of that era, since that since such tight new moon slash Jupiter conjunctions only occur about once every 27 years. But to have this Jupiter Sun Moon conjunction oppose Mars at the same time would have made this a definite must see event for ancient skywatchers. Observers in India, however, would have seen something more, something that would have made the whole alignment take on a far greater personal urgency. The alignment straddled both their eastern and western horizons at the precise instant that the new moon became exact. Such an unusual angular alignment, the Magi would have known, occurs only once in many thousands of years. Parans, or near simultaneous angle crossings such as these, were considered extremely important in ancient astrology. Sorry. Uh, of course, risings were held to be of far greater importance than settings. Risings were the future, while settings were the past. This simple fact might have caused those imperial counselors concern, for the glorious Jupiter new moon alignment setting precisely on their western horizon would have carried the uncomfortable suggestion that their own civilization might be about to fall, while some other martial force indicated by Mars rising at the same time on the opposite horizon might be poised to appear. Would those magi have been confident that this was the correct interpretation of the alignment? Surely not. Experience would have likely taught them to be wary of jumping to extreme conclusions, but some concern probably would have crossed their minds, and they would have made a point of watching this alignment closely, measuring it as best they could. On that dark new moon evening, India's magi would have been paying close attention to this alignment in their skies, and after they watched the sun set on their western horizon, they would have naturally turned to observe Mars rising like clockwork in the east, and as they carefully monitored its slow upward progress into the night sky, they would have been in perfect position to see a strange new star they'd never noticed before. Uranus was just below Mars in the sky that night, and though Uranus is commonly assumed to be invisible to the naked eye, this is not entirely true. Objects with an apparent visual magnitude of 6, such as Uranus, can be seen with the naked eye when conditions are right. The Magi had a long-standing reputation as excellent astrologers and believed themselves to be thoroughly familiar with all the visible stars in the zodiac. If they happened to notice Uranus rising up beneath Mars that night, they would immediately have realized that it didn't belong, that it hadn't been there before, at least not according to their records, and just as the Bible recorded, they would indeed have first spotted this new star, En te Anatole, rising in the east just as the sun was setting in the west. And the star moved. What would have been the Magi's reaction if they'd spotted Uranus? They probably would have done just what the Bible reports. At first, they would have studied it carefully, and after some months of observation, Uranus moved slowly. They would have realized, to their astonishment, that it was not just another fixed star at all, but instead a whole new planet, another moving star, another god. Two things conspired to keep Uranus invisible to them before that night. Its invisibility comes and goes, and it moves around from place to place in the sky. It is the only planet in our solar system that has both these qualities. The rest of the known planets also move around, of course, but their visibility remains relatively constant. The visibility of many low magnitude stars also comes and goes, but since they always stay in the same place, it remains a simple matter to confirm their existence and exact position. The ancient Magi would have been able to return again and again to restudy and remeasure and re-examine all the other visible stars. And over the centuries, every last star could have been verified and re-verified, even those whose light fluctuated on the edges of visibility. But Uranus was not But Uranus not only appeared and disappeared depending on the viewing conditions, but it moved around as well. But eventually, Uranus is, after all, visible to the naked eye at least some of the time. One might reasonably assume that the Magi would have noticed it sooner or later. Their reaction suggests they did just that. Do we know where the Magi were when they made this famous sighting? The Bible only says in the east, but we may be able to narrow that down a bit. Any Magi living near the Indus Valley in India would have monitored the event closely enough to put the elusive Uranus, to spot the elusive Uranus. Legends about the biblical Magi support this possibility, identifying at least one of those travelers as indeed being from India. Hindu tradition also supports this theory. Not only has astrology been respected and studied in India for ages, but Vedic scriptures suggest that Uranus was, in actual fact, discovered millennia ago by Indian stargazers, and according to Israel's records, Magi from the east saw a strange new moving star in the sky sometime around 1 BC and concluded from what they saw that a new god had just been born. Coincidence? Okay, so there is a picture here. I'm going to flip back. It was on this past page. Eastern astronomers studying the night sky at the time of Jesus' birth. Doesn't say who the artist is, but there we go. Of course, it looks like they're looking at a comet, not a moving star, but all right. We'll let it slide. Okay. Journey to see a god. It would have taken months of observation to be sure that Uranus was really moving, and by that time, winter's rains would have arrived, requiring any travel plans to be postponed until spring. The long, arduous, and dangerous overland route from India to Israel would have been unimaginably unpleasant. That the Magi were willing to undertake such a journey at all speaks volumes about how confident they were about their interpretation of the star's meaning and its urgency. According to T.E. Lawrence, the famous British liaison officer during the Arab Revolt of 1916 to 1918, an inexperienced person riding a camel can cover about 30 miles per day. Departing from India in the spring, the Magi would have arrived in Israel sometime in late summer or early fall. Convinced the divine child had been born the instant they first saw the star, the Magi would have expected him to be slightly over a year old by then. When Herod became privy to what the Magi knew, he was furious. He gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. Matthew 2:16. According to Jewish reckoning at the time, a child of 1 year and 1 month was considered 2 years old. I've heard that before. The Chinese had the same, very similar. They considered you a year old when you were born. The only real evidence for the Star of Bethlehem is the Magi's reaction, their sojourn in search of a newborn God. The possibilities that they spotted an unfamiliar new planet fits their response better than any other natural phenomenon they could have witnessed. Planetary conjunctions, comets, and so on were all relatively familiar sights, especially for a caste of priests that had been carefully monitoring the heavens for over 500 years. The discovery of a new planet would have been unprecedented. So far as we know, this was the only time that Magi ever took a road trip to go and worship an unknown newborn. And we have another picture here. The wise men following the auspicious star, which may have been the planet Uranus, to Bethlehem. Illustration by Gustave Doré. Come on, focus. There we go. The month and date. Were the Magi correct in assuming that Jesus had been born at the exact instant of the new moon of September 16th, 1 BC? There does appear to be some evidence that Jesus was born in September. For instance, the report that, quote unquote, Shepherds were watching their flocks by night. Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 12. Fits a September birth date. Far better than one in December. Shepherds were not out in the fields in winter. Song of Solomon 2:11, Ezra 10, 9 and 13. Chapter 10, verses 9 and 13. The ancient custom among Jews was to send their sheep out to fields and deserts in early spring and bring them home at the commencement of the first rain, generally no later than October 15th. Still, that only narrows down the likely date of the nativity to half a year. However, a curious early Christian practice specifically suggests a September nativity. In the earliest years of the church, during the September Jewish feast of Rosh Hashanah, Christians seem to have carried on their own mysterious celebrations behind closed doors, which some have suggested were the first Christmas festivities. Remarkably, some evidence even supports the actual date of September 16th, 1 BC. This happens to have been the first day of Rosh Hashanah for that year, when the population of Jerusalem would have swelled from about 100,000 people to over 1,000,000. With all those people, there would have been little room at the inns of Jerusalem and the surrounding towns, just as the Bible reported. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, a symbolically appropriate date for the birth of their Messiah. Was Jesus born on September 16th, 1 BC? Curiously, the astrological chart for this new moon appears not only to correspond with the biblical account of Jesus' person and history, but also to match the subsequent history of the Christian church. The Magi, of course, would have seen this as appropriate, since the birth of Jesus Christ was also the birth of Christianity. More curious is the fact that the ancient birth chart appears, despite all reason, to reflect many of the most significant secular developments of the last 2,000 years as well. All right, we got through it. That was the second article, and that's all I'm going to read tonight. I'm not doing so hot on the reading. So, part 2 of the book goes into following the golden thread, Templars and Freemasons. So I have a feeling we'll read a little bit about some of the same stuff we read in the Temple and the Lodge, but specifically on the religious side of stuff. So we'll plan on reading Articles 7 and 8 next time, and yeah, we'll pick that up on Tuesday. I am thinking about cutting back a little bit on this, doing Sundays and Thursdays for reading on this series, and then like Wednesdays and Fridays for the Star Wars. I'm not sure. I want it to be spread out throughout the week, not clustered. That would be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday all in a row. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Maybe Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday, Thursday would be okay. And then the other nights in between would be pure gaming nights. I don't know. I'll think about it, but we'll rearrange and figure that out. So that'll be it for this session. I am going to end it, and we'll. I don't think I'm going to raid anybody tonight. I raided last night. That'll do. Um, I haven't decided if I want a game, so I may or may not be back. We'll see you later.